That's where the black mold scare kind of, uh, enwrapped this country back in the late 1990s when they said Stachybotrys was the black mold. And now if you have black mold, you have a big problem. There's also 11 different species of molds that have a black appearance. So just because you see a black mold doesn't mean you have Stachybotrys. You actually have to test it to find out what mold genera that you're working with. Otherwise, it can be it kind of raise a false alarm towards the hazard related to that particular mold.
You've tried everything. You've changed your diet, you've detoxed, you've even moved homes, and yet you still feel sick. Headaches, brain fog, fatigue that no one can explain. What if it's not you? What if it's your environment? Welcome to Mold, Mycotoxins and More. I'm John Bohde. Each week, I sit down with experts uncovering how mold, mycotoxins, and environmental exposures affect your health and what real recovery looks like. Let's get into today's conversation. The information provided on the Mold Pros podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Listening to the podcast does not create a doctor-patient or professional-client relationship between you and the podcast host, guest, or the Mold Pros. The content shared should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. And always seek the medical advice of your physician or qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition, potential mold exposure, or health concerns. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you heard on this podcast. And while we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we make no representations or warranties of any kind, express or implied, about the completeness, accuracy, reliability, or suitability of all the information discussed. And guest experience and outcomes discussed on this podcast are individual cases and should not be considered typical results. Your situation may differ significantly. As always, if you think you have a medical emergency, call your doctor or 911 immediately. By listening to the Mold Pros podcast, you acknowledge that you understood this disclosure. Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Mold, Mycotoxins and More. I'm your host, John Bohde, and today we have a very special guest, not only a well-recognized peer and expert in the environmental industry, but a guy that I consider to be a good friend. Let me introduce to you Steve Parkhurst with Advanced Building Forensics. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John. That's a very generous opening and introduction. I really appreciate it. I know we've been colleagues and friends for somewhere between 10 to 15 years. Is that an accurate count? I know it's 10 years, but at the same time, it just shows how well we've gotten along over the last decade or so, and how our synergies between both our personal lives and our professional lives integrate well together.
No doubt, no doubt. Well, we want to share today with our audience, the dozens and dozens of people that are listening today. Steve, we want to teach them a little bit more and talk a little bit more about your company, Advanced Building Forensics. You know, you've built Advanced Building Forensics into a powerhouse in Southwest Florida and beyond. Can you walk us through how you got into this field? How did it all start for you, and what led you to become specialized in environmental forensics rather than just becoming a traditional mold inspector?
That's a great question, John. Most people do not grow up to be a certified industrial hygienist. It's not on that list of top career paths that you see in ninth grade that you would aspire to be an environmental forensic scientist. It's just not on the list. So my goal in high school and college was to become a biologist, which I ended up with a degree in biology from the University of Cincinnati. After getting out of college, I looked around and thought, what can a biologist do? And I didn't like the career choices, so I ended up finding this field called industrial hygiene. I fell in love with it because it integrates law, science, unions, corporations, households, just about everything on the planet can fall under this little niche called industrial hygiene, which has a broader appeal in environmental science, which is what I ended up getting a master's degree also from the University of Cincinnati. After that, I followed the path of industrial hygiene and became certified as an industrial hygienist. probably one of the more difficult examinations known to man. I think it has an attrition rate of somewhere around 70%, and you have to have either an advanced degree, advanced degrees such as a master's degree, and a degree in the physical sciences such as physics, chemistry, and/or biology. And then you pass a 2-day test, which was a rigorous examination. But after that, you just kind of follow your passions in that particular field. You look what the market's doing, and back in the 80s, asbestos tended to be the designer contaminant of that era. So we worked on some of the largest asbestos litigation projects or cases in the world. There was a W.R. Grace, U.S. Gypsum, and National Gypsum case that was nationwide. We actually put teams of industrial hygienists together. I led a team for about 5 years or so, and we went across the nation looking at different buildings, what kind of asbestos materials around, and was there contamination occurring from the sloughing off or the degradation of the asbestos products that were in these buildings. So that's kind of how I got my foot into the litigation support arena. And it was kind of a convoluted, unexpected pathway, but I completely enjoyed it and thoroughly liked the integration of both law and science and how they affect each other.
It certainly is multidisciplinary. You know, you have the biological or the science side of things, and then going back and understanding essentially construction, right, and how structures are built and that sort of thing. And it's a good combination. Of course, you've added, you're an expert witness for court cases and litigation, do a lot of that work. So there's a lot of things. You're not siloed and being really good at one thing. You know, when I was looking at your website, it mentions that, you know, you use tools like DNA analysis and infrared thermal imaging, and you know that's kind of the same stuff that CIS investigators use, right? So you've been doing this for a long time. How has technology changed the game for identifying hidden mold and moisture issues that a lot of traditional visual inspections or standard mold remediation or mold inspection would miss?
Well, just in the past 20 years, John, you look at what we had in the 90s with regards to how did we detect mold that was airborne. We used to set out petri dishes, if you remember that technology. The petri dishes would sit there for a couple hours, and then you'd send them off to a lab, and the lab would allow them to grow for 7 to 10 days. So that was our analytical method for actually detecting airborne mold. Well, back in the early 2000s, they invented, I think, a man by the name of Dan Baxter, who now works at EAA, invented the aerosol cassette or the Zephon cassette. And that allows us to measure the spores in the air and actually have a turnaround of anywhere from 2 hours to 24 hours on airborne mold spore levels. So that really compressed the time that from being on site to getting your analysis to understanding the built environment's exposure to mold and what some of the repercussions behind those exposures would be. So that was a huge technological change. Then we had the advent of infrared thermography. That was borrowed from, I think, the military industrial complex. They used it first. They had it on helicopters looking for bad guys in the forest because their body would light up like an orange candle in the middle of the night. So then they'd know exactly where to pinpoint the enemy. Well, we use the same technology, just a little less sophisticated than the military. I think FLIR is one of the more dominant infrared thermographic companies out there, but they designed one for the built environment, which allows us to look at temperature differentials between a wet environment and a dry environment. And by doing that, we can see a big picture, just like the warm body that shows up in in a forest at night. We see purple images on our infrared camera that might indicate water impact or something that's damp that needs to be looked at. Otherwise, visually, you couldn't see anything because it's looking at infrared wavelengths, not visual wavelengths, and we're able to detect things that the naked eye can't see, or even a moisture meter isn't going to be able to detect until you get very close to it. So you also mentioned DNA. That's also been a new advent. People don't realize DNA analysis, we think that it's been with us for decades, a long time. Well, it actually didn't become pervasive until about 1984. And that's when I think in 1987 it was actually accepted into the courts. It took a while for it to get that type of veracity that we could count on it. And then it started exploding as a diagnostic mechanism so that we could understand some of the genetic issues that are ongoing in the medical practice. The way we use DNA is by identifying organisms. Just like human beings have DNA, so do biological organisms such as mold and bacteria. And we're able to look at the DNA of it and identify it much more accurately and even quicker than we can under a microscope. So there's more certainty to it, and it brings much more bulletproof evidence, if necessary, in a legal setting.
Yeah, we use DNA sampling or testing heavily when we need to understand the species of a mold, right? So there's standardized mold testing, of course, a spore trap or surface sample, anything that's going to be direct microscopic exam or looked at underneath the microscope will take us to the genus level, and it'll tell us do we have Aspergillus or Cladosporium or Stachybotrys, etc. We understand that certain species of those organisms are capable of producing toxins, and so oftentimes it's helpful to understand, do we have toxigenic or pathogenic fungal species? And that's where we use a lot of DNA testing. Is that the same for you?
Yeah, that's exactly right. If you take, for example, a spore trap sample, it takes a genera called Penicillium aspergillus, and it combines these two mold genera into one cat figure. And the reason that's both helpful and detrimental, it's helpful in the sense that you can get a bigger picture of Aspergillus and Penicillium, but it doesn't tell you what species. And among those two different genera, I believe there's 160 Penicillium species and 200 Aspergillus species. So you have somewhere between 350 to 400 different species that are agglomerated into one number. And so the optical methods just aren't able to discern what those species are. So the DNA comes in, particularly in medical situations where you have Aspergillus fumigatus, Aspergillus flavus, and several others which are highly pathogenic. And if you just do a penicillin aspergillus screen, you don't know if they're there or not. But if you do the DNA analysis, now you can go, aha, we've got Aspergillus fumigatus, which could lead to a very severe fungal infection called aspergillosis.
There's our approach with inspections, and I'd be interested to see if you agree. Direct microscopic exam is going to be kind of like that broad net. If we use analogy of net fishing, you're throwing it out there. What you capture is what you capture. Whenever we're doing DNA testing, they have to, at the lab, they load in that DNA probe to say, okay, how much DNA of Aspergillus fumigatus or Aspergillus ocratius do we have? And so it's DNA testing or polymerase chain reaction testing, the other nomenclature for it, much more narrow but much more sensitive and deeper. So standardized mold testing, we would think, is more broad but more shallow because it doesn't get down to the species level, and then that DNA testing, narrow and much deeper. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, that's a very accurate way of looking at it. I know the test that the EPA developed back in 2005 by Dr. Stephen Vesper. It was called ERMI, the Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. It's been a little controversial. At the same time, it kind of paved the way for DNA analysis to be used in the built environment. So it actually looks at about 36 different mold species, whereas if you do the optical method, you get about 25 mold genera. So you're right, you get a more granular look at the data with regards to DNA analysis versus the optical method. There's there's uses for both, and you just have to know the limitations and the abilities of each method and the purpose of what your data is going to be used for in order to select which methods is most useful for that moment.
If we didn't bore everybody to death, I think if we ever do a follow up to this, would be actually what mold test. Each test has its strengths and weaknesses, right? And so, in the
Sure.
proper application. So that's one of the biggest questions I get is what's the best test? And I always say, well, the answer is, well, there isn't one that's simply best. It's what we're trying to understand is plugging in the right test for that. You you had mentioned the use of infrared thermal cameras and how it can help pick up moisture issues. You and I are both blessed to live in Southwest Florida, where it's hopefully going to be a nice balmy 80 degrees here in December today. But we're on the front lines oftentimes when hurricanes or major storms hit. So I was kind of interested in your perspective. Of course, we have a lot of listeners in the state of Texas as well that gets hit, in Louisiana, et cetera. What are the biggest mistakes, Steve, that you see that property owners make during that critical, 24, 48-hour time frame after a water event? Not necessarily, it didn't have to be a hurricane, but just any kind of water event. And how does that impact long-term mold development?
I think the biggest method is they either take too long to start drying, they don't do well on their humidity control. And to be honest, that's a hard issue to do down here, especially after a catastrophic event, because if you have a flood of anywhere from 6 inches to 2 feet of water into your home, that's catastrophic to your home. That's a sentinel event that you need to carefully understand what's happening to your home at that moment in time. Some people will, they turn their air conditioners off, or maybe the energy is not even there because of the storm. That happens, that their homes get de-energized. But the problem is trying to get the water out of a built environment that's not designed to be water impervious. I mean, everything in your home absorbs water for the most part. So you need to do everything possible to get the humidity down, get the water out. One of the big mistakes I see is they'll start, once the energy comes back up, they'll put dehumidifiers in. Well, if it's past 3 to 5 days, there's no value in trying to save the drywall that's on the wall. There's just zero value. I've seen projects where they put these dehumidifiers in for 2 weeks and the drywall is still wet. There's already mold growing. And I'm going, you just wasted 2 weeks of time. You need to just cut it out at the 4 feet mark, get rid of it, open up the wall cavities, and start drying the structure at this point. The other big mistake on a water event is, what do you do with the floor tile? There's always a big controversy between the insurance company and the homeowner about what to do with it. But we also know that the floor tile, we have little instruments that actually measure about 3/4 of an inch beneath the tile. And it will tell us if water's trapped in there. The floor may look completely dry, and it may even have a solid feel or sound to it. But if there's water trapped beneath that tile, it really has no place to go, and it's nearly impossible to dry out. So we usually make the recommendation once we start detecting moisture beneath the floor tile to pull it out. Well, some homeowners are in love with their tile. They don't want to pull it out. And I warn them, well, it may not detach today or tomorrow, but 6 months from now or 2 years from now, the bonding agents used to attach the floor tile to the substrate may often detach, and they'll start cracking, popping, chipping, and now you've got a mess in your home because the floor is now compromised and there's still moisture beneath of it, which will harbor mold and bacteria. Most of these losses too If you want to get a little deeper into the weeds, we call them different categories by the IACRC S500.
You've cleaned, repainted, and replaced filters, and still, you're not getting better. Headache, fatigue, brain fog, the doctors can't explain it, but your environment can. At the Mold Pros, we specialize in uncovering what's hidden in plain sight. Our environmental testing looks beyond surface mold, identifying bacteria, volatile organic compounds, and even mycotoxins in the air that you breathe. Then we correlate those results with your clinical data, showing how your space may be affecting your health. Next, we use our patented remediation process to safely remove toxins, restore balance, and prevent them from returning. It's more than just a cleanup. It's a science-based system designed to help your body heal by healing the environment first. If you're ready to breathe freely again, visit themoldpros.com and schedule your free consultation. Because wellness doesn't start in the doctor's office. It starts where you live.
So you have different categories of water contamination or bacterial contamination in the water. Category one is nomenclature that we use when it's like a potable water release, fresh water, maybe out of a drinking line. Category two is water that is perhaps from a roof leak or from can be from a sanitary source like a dishwasher, a washing machine, where there's something mixed in it. And then category three is we call it a black water. It doesn't have to be black, but it's usually can be discolored. But that's usually where you get the pathogens. All flood waters are considered category three. Water that sits for more than several days can now start growing bacteria and mold in it. That becomes category three. So now you get that category three water trapped below your floor. What are you going to do with it? So we usually test for it. I think every test I've ever taken after a flood shows you have category three water trapped beneath the floor. We'll actually chip up a piece of tile, collect a sample from the substrate, and it always comes back with E. coliform bacteria, Escherichia coli. These are all contaminants that indicate fecal contamination. Then you can get salmonella and Bacillus cereus and some other very significant pathogens trapped beneath there as well.
Yeah, that's what, when we have these events, we get the calls. Everybody, after 3 or 4 days, you may see mold growth. You can see it. You can oftentimes smell it if the microbial volatile organic compounds are cranking up. But people don't really think about some of the other pathogens that's there, the endotoxins, from bacteria that can thrive in those environments as well. You're not a clinician or a practitioner in that way, but since we've kind of gone down that path for some of these bacterial exposures, in addition to some of those biotoxin exposures, are there any health implications that people should be aware of in general when they have these water events?
Well, sure. Yeah, you definitely, would recommend someone wearing an N95 into that environment. That we all became familiar with N95 respirators during the COVID era because everybody wore those as a means to protect against viral components. They do a much better job with bacteria and mold because the bacteria and mold particles are much larger than virus particles. So they do a great job at protecting our respiratory system. The other thing you'd want to do is wear gloves and maybe have some disposable shoes on. If you're doing the remediation side of it, then you really want to, suit up into, a Tyvek overall, have maybe even a better respiratory system that has canisters on it as opposed to just an N95, dust respirator. That's a little bit more of a serious. I think your company, the Mold Pros, gets more into the personal protective equipment for remediation contractors. The homeowners, especially if they have mold allergies, they should avoid the environment. If they have a compromised immune system, stay clear. If they are on chemotherapy medications, absolutely do not go into these environments. We had a very interesting case several years ago where a very, we'll say, high profile person in the Naples area had one mold consultant come in and found very high levels of mold spores in her unit, and it was about 25,000 was the count, if I recall correctly, which is about 25 times higher than normal. Her partner was on chemotherapy medication for a brain tumor, and so she was very concerned about, what was causing this. Well, she fired her first mold inspector. This is when a CIH may be more appropriate than a typical mold assessor. She fired her first one because they couldn't find a source. I spent about 6 hours looking at HVAC systems, looking at the water systems. And on my way out the door, we took all kinds of samples. On my way out the door, I noticed this client had a plethora of fresh water plants in her home. And I looked at the base of these plants, and I noticed a green film that was on top of the water. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I took a swab out of one of the plants, sent it for analysis, and it came back loaded with bacteria, biofilms, and Aspergillus fumigatus.
Really?
Yeah. So I told my client. She called me a couple of days later. I called her with the results, and I said, "Man, you need to start thinking like a man." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Buy silk plants." And she's like, "You're nuts." She's like, "Well," she goes, "I'll consider that, but let me get back with you on that." So I don't know what she was going to do to consider, but she called me back 3 days later and she goes, "Steve, you don't know this, but I'm on the board of Tulane University's Medical College, and I consulted with 3 PhD MDs about the problem you found in my house, and they all agreed with you. Get rid of the plants." And she explained that they all said every hospital environment that you go into, they do not permit fresh plants, flowers, anything organic to grow because of mold, pollen, and bacteria that they bring into the hospital environment. So I felt very nervous initially about it, but she kind of gave me the consolation that I had some pretty powerful scientists behind me that agreed with my recommendation. So that was kind of one of those moments where you have to think outside the box. And a normal mold inspector is just going to check your standard stuff, but someone with 45 years of experience, a CIH and a master's degree, they're going to think a little bit more deeper into a more complex problem that you might be experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of mold inspectors in air quotes, right? That
Mhm.
come in. We call them pump jockeys. They come in and they're there for 30 minutes. They grab a couple of air samples, do an exterior baseline, and leave. And that's always a big challenge because if you're making decisions based, on your home, arguably the largest asset that many people own, or certainly from a health perspective, you're making assessments on potentially bad data. And we always have the mindset that bad data is worse than no data oftentimes. And so that's an interesting case. What are some of the other things, that's as a certified industrial hygienist, your approach was obviously different, a little deeper than some, but what are some of the other things that you see that oftentimes gets overlooked from a standard mold assessor?
Well, just like in any profession, you have different varying degrees of competency. And, a standard mold assessor, maybe they came from the construction industry, maybe they had a little bit of experience with building. I know one guy in particular that was in the construction industry, and then his boss said, "We've got a water damage problem. Go figure it out." And he got into the field that way, and he's actually been very successful. But again, most people don't grow up to be a mold assessor. You don't. have that on your resume as something you aspire to. And most people just kind of morph into the field out of cause, necessity, or curiosity. If if they're if they're ambitious about what they want to do, then they go into another level of professionalism, and that's where we are, where we look at things in the built environment versus just as a mold issue or a water damage issue. We try to take in a holistic approach towards what's going on and the dynamics of this environment that are not managing the moisture well, that are not keeping the humidity levels down, or where did this water come from? What's the water source, so we can identify the potential health concerns relating to that particular water source. How long has it been there? Because that length of time, mold has something called a water activity level. And when you're at low water activity levels, you have certain molds that grow. But when you're at high water activity levels, you have other molds that grow, such as Stachybotrys and Chaetomium and Memnonella, Fusarium. And all these tertiary colonizers produce more toxigenic things, such as mycotoxins. And that's where the black mold scare kind of, uh, enwrapped this country back in the late 1990s, when they said Stachybotrys was the black mold. And now, if you have black mold, you have a big problem. Well, that can be true, but there's also 11 different species of molds that have a black appearance. So just because you see a black mold doesn't mean you have Stachybotrys. You actually have to test it to find out what mold genera that you're working with. Otherwise, it can be a false. You kind of raise a false alarm towards the hazard related to that particular mold exposure.
Yeah, and there's a European paper by Dr. Christian Nelson, I believe, that talks about, it's a study on indoor molds. And just because you may have a toxigenic species doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be producing those toxins. So you can have Stachybotrys chartrum and not have the trichothecenes being produced because, according to this study, you don't have the right environmental conditions, that whether it's temperature or water activity or food source or even other microorganisms that contribute to whether those species produce toxins or not. So kind of interesting
That's a
stuff.
very astute comment, because I'm not sure they have a full understanding on why molds produce mycotoxins under what circumstances. I know I saw one study about 5 years ago that showed about 67% of the time they do produce mycotoxins. The other 33%, they're like going, we don't know why they didn't. So, you know, I guess based on that, you can assume you most likely have mycotoxins if you have Stachybotrys. At least 67% of the time, the probability to be it's most likely there. But there's a way. I mean, the mycotoxins are a very controversial issue because they're kind of hard to measure. It seems like the analytical process is um, both an art and a science. And I'm not a laboratory chemist or technician, but I know people that are, and there's a lot of different methods to do it. The courts have been ambivalent, if not problematic, when it comes to looking at mycotoxin exposure, whether it's a biological specimen or an environmental specimen that's submitted for analysis. I've seen cases where mycotoxins are accepted by the courts, and I've seen other cases where they're rejected by the courts and the data is actually dismissed. So you need to, if you're going to go down a mycotoxin legal pathway, for some personal injury or exposure, you better have a CIH, a good doctor, and a strong laboratory supporting your your case. Otherwise, you're most likely going to get dismissed, or some of your data is going to get dismissed out of the courts.
You do a fair amount, as we mentioned earlier, of expert witness testimony, and I think you've been involved with hundreds of cases. And if I remember correctly, you have over a 90% success rate, if that's
We're
accurate.
about 95%. Yeah, we
Oh,
do very good in the legal setting. I, I like to tell my clients the majority of our cases settle shortly after our deposition. Um, and the reason is, when you're doing depositions, the other side's trying to figure out how good of an expert this guy is. Is he going to crumble on the stand? Can he handle some of the back and forth and tension that's created in the deposition? Is he knowledgeable? How good of an expert is he? So, like I said, most of them settle shortly after our deposition just because they realize we're not going to crumble on the stand. We're going to provide expert testimony that supports our opinions. Our opinions are based in fact and science, and they're not just speculative, anecdotal opinions that are easily dismantled. So we do very well with the expert witness work. It's not something most CIHs do. I'd say maybe 10% of us actually go down that path. Another only 10% CIHs are kind of in a category of, most of us grew up in industry. So we had, they call us an industrial hygienist. So we were looking at chemical exposures. And that's what I did for the first 20 years of my career. And it wasn't until the late 1990s that we started seeing the built environment having, we tightened up all the buildings, right? In the 70s and 80s. We tightened the buildings up, and then all of a sudden we had sick building syndrome, and that caused mold growth and bacteria within the building confines. And that's where the industrial hygienist kind of morphed into the biological side of the equation more than the chemical side. And so many industrial hygienists didn't make that transition. I was one of them that did, and just kind of followed the industry patterns and trends, and glad I did at this point, for sure.
We talk about all the litigation work, and oftentimes that involves, especially after storms, what insurance companies want to pay for and what needs to be done for a really proper remediation. So what have you gleaned from all the expert witness testimony work that you've done, et cetera, how to kind of bridge that gap? Any thoughts?
Well, for the first advice I give my clients is buy a mold rider. Most of your insurance policies have a $10,000 cap when it comes to mold in your home, and they don't cost too much more to get a $25,000 or $50,000 mold rider. Otherwise, they're going to cap your $10,000, and you and I both know my studies alone run anywhere from $1,500 to $5,000 depending on the size of the home. Remediation usually starts at $10,000 and goes up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Again, depending on the home. So depending on the size of the house, we'd say at least get a mold rider somewhere between $25,000 to $50,000. Talk to an insurance agent based on the value of your property to know what's a good number for your home environment. Same with your business environment as well. Beyond that, and I don't try to disparage the insurance industry, but they don't always look that hard for the damages related to whether it's water damage or fire damage or whatever the issue is. And so they sit down a guy that may be fairly competent, but they don't spend the time in a home that, such as what you and I might spend, because we're actually there not to cover a claim. We're actually there because we know our client has to reside in this environment for the rest of their life, perhaps. And we need to know what their medical conditions are. We need to know if there's infants. We need to know the circumstances of their family. And we're going to take all of that into consideration when we develop a protocol and the standard of care that needs to be applied to that particular, residential setting or commercial setting. So we're going to be far more thorough, far more competent, far more diligent in identifying the water impacted and moldy building materials than what insurance might send out to do as a cursory review just for claim adjustment. So we want to make sure that when you move back into the home, that I would put my own family into that home, not just somebody else's family that I don't know. So I always ask that question: would I put my sons and daughters in this house? When I say it's clean and it's ready to go.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I've always viewed you as a specialist in what you do. You always have really interesting projects that you're working on, and certainly just a wealth of knowledge. For the listeners today, if you can maybe opine on when is a good time to hire a certified industrial hygienist such as yourself, and I guess conversely, when does it make less sense, quite candidly, to bring you aboard?
Well,
What
that's
are
a
your
great
thoughts?
question because you don't need a CIH on a little plumbing failure. Maybe your washing machine leaked and now you've got a laundry room and an adjacent room. Probably don't need a CIH. A good competent mold inspector, water damage specialist can define that project and do a competent job for you. Where the CIH really comes in is, are there medical issues at stake? Are there legal issues at stake? How big is the claim? The claim is less than $25,000. It's probably not valuable to bring a CIH in because we're going to cost $3,000 to $5,000 just to do whatever we do. If it's something where there's $100,000 involved, $1 million involved in a claim, absolutely. That's when the stakes are high, the medical issues are significant, the legal issues are paramount, and you want to know with certainty, beyond I guess the legal standard is the propensity of the evidence for civil cases. We try to go one step further and go the preponderance of the evidence and beyond a reasonable doubt is the standard. That's a criminal standard versus a civil standard. But we try to build the strongest case possible with legally defensible data and opinions that hold up in court and are able to win, our cases with far more veracity, far more legitimacy and competency. And if that's what you need, then that's when you need to hire a CIH. But make sure you interview the CIHs. There's maybe 10,000 of us in the world. We're usually an educated group. I think 25% of the CIHs have a PhD. Another 25% have a master's degree, like I do, and then the balance of them have a degree in physics, chemistry, engineering, or biology. So, but you need to have a CIH that understands your specific issue. And if they don't understand your issue, then they're like an attorney. We kind of niche our markets and we do phenomenal at fire, chemical exposures, and mold. But there are cases where I say I'm just not a good fit for that. Please find somebody else.
Steve, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Sure. Well, we have a website. Obviously, they can get a hold of us through the Mold Press since we've got a great relationship there. But we do have our own advanced building forensics website. You can Google us. We've got advanced building forensics. Also, my cell phone number is 239-220-6190. And then we have a hard line that comes in at 239-676-1104. I think on our website too, you can actually email us through the website and contact us there, and we'll respond. We usually respond to everything within 24 hours. We try to be sensitive to our clients' demands and help them out.
Very good. Yeah, if as you point out, they could also reach out to info@themoldpros.com and we can help direct traffic that way as well. Really appreciate you carving out time. I think the information is valuable. Man, you and I can always talk for hours around this. We're passionate about what we do. Our goal should be one of these days on career day that the kids ask their fathers to come in because they're actually mold assessors. And it's
Yeah,
it's a career
that would
day
be an interesting day. Yeah. Well, we definitely should do this again. This has been an interesting format for me. I don't do this very often. I've done over 100 depositions, 12 trials, and 500 or more litigation support cases. But a podcast is a new media environment for me. So I hope we can continue doing this particular format again. I think it seems to be very effective, and enjoy the dialogue back and forth. It's nice being interviewed by somebody that actually knows mold and has similar experiences and approaches towards trying to create a safe, uh, healthy environment for our listeners.
All right, we'll get you back on really as soon as we can, as soon as the schedules will allow. Well, thanks everyone for listening to Mold, Mycotoxins, and More. I'm your host, John Bohde, and we look forward to talking with you again next week. Thanks. You've been listening to Mold, Mycotoxins, and More with John Bohde. If you're ready to take the next step towards a healthier home, follow the show and visit themoldpros.com for your free consultation. Because clean air is the first step to true healing.